So hello everybody, I'm Joe Pennell. I'm joined by Andy Stewart. We're here today to talk to you about realigning technology and M&A transactions. So the clicker would probably be critical for this.
You've got to pause there, haven't you? It's been a long day. That has to be the funniest slide you've seen so far.
We are your most enthusiastic presenters. Guaranteed.
Some sort of before and after. Joe should be very worried. But actually the reality is I'm only 1 year older than Joe. And that's a picture of me on the right before I learned about GDPR.
So a little bit of background here before we dive in. So our technology transactions practice has been increasingly involved in M&A transactions over the past several years. And that's consistent with what others are seeing in the broader marketplace. So according to Boston Consulting Group, 1 out of every 5 M&A deals nowadays has some clear link to technology in one form or another. What Deloitte has found is that technology is now the #1 driver of new M&A pursuits, and either acquisition of technology or a digital strategy accounts for a full 1/3 of all deals being pursued. So for today's focus, just to bring it down a level, we're going to be focused on carve-out deals. So before a carve-out, the target business, the seller, and third parties likely have a complex service and technology environment. Lots of different interconnection points. That gets even more complicated once the divested business moves over to the buyer. So without the right contractual protections in place and the right planning, things can go south quickly. So we won't be running through every M&A issue here, but we'll focus on how the parties may have to realign technology and service delivery to meet their goals. So real quick, here's our agenda. First, we'll run through 2 carve-out divestiture scenarios just to make things a little bit more real and tangible as we go through the presentation. Andy will kick off some technology considerations for transaction planning and due diligence. And then finally, we'll go through some key considerations for purchase agreements, TSAs, and long-term service agreements. So first, bank carve-out scenario. A bank is divesting its back office processing business. So this business services the bank itself, plus other banks in the region using an outsourced services model. The potential buyers are all outsourced service providers in the financial services industry, and the business is attracted to the buyers for a couple of reasons. First, there's the value of the existing customer contracts with the other banks, and then second, the business is primed for a shift. So currently they're more of a traditional outsourced services US FTE-based model. They can move to a lower cost SaaS model, greater automation, lower costs, higher profits, et cetera. So that's part of the consistent valuation messaging. And then finally, and this is a key point, there's going to be a long-term services agreement between the business and the seller, and the business is going to continue to service the seller as its largest customer account. So that's going to be very critical to the transaction, and we'll get into that. Second scenario involves a manufacturing company. So the manufacturer is selling one of its portfolio brands, and it's selling it to a private equity firm who, interestingly enough, has no manufacturing capability of its own. The seller has a global supply chain across many different jurisdictions, so lots of issues there. And then finally, the buyer will be acquiring one of the seller's key production facilities. The plant is also used to manufacture products of the seller's retained brands, and the parties will be entering into a long-term operation or manufacturing services agreement for the seller to operate that plant on behalf of the buyer. And I'll hand it over to Andy to talk about some technology considerations and due diligence issues.
Thank you, Joe. So, define the business. What is being sold? These kind of carve-out deals, they are never a situation where it's just a question of the seller junking a bunch of stuff it no longer wants and getting rid of it. When you're looking at one of these carve-out transactions, The seller's got to look not just at what it includes in the carve-out so as to maximize the value. It needs to think long and hard about what it needs to retain for its existing business. So, for example, in the banking carve-out that Joe was just describing, where the real value for the target business is the contracts with these other businesses, then if tech is relevant to that, then the buyer is going to be very interested in making sure it has access to that technology as part of the value that it's paying for the business. But then Joe also mentioned that this business was transitioning to a lower cost software as a service solution, in which case maybe that technology is not as relevant as it might otherwise be. All questions for the buyer. Similarly, for the seller, they're going to have some form of long-term supply agreement coming back in their direction, so they're going to want to make sure that they've got access to the relevant technology to make that worthwhile. And in the manufacturing carve-out that we talked about, real practical difficulties in carving out one brand out of a great array of brands from an organization like that. Fully integrated supply chain produces difficulties in a whole host of areas. If you take the ERP system, for example, quite possibly doesn't look at this particular business being carved out as a standalone unit. So how is it going to be pulled together, carved out, and handed over to the buyer? Similarly, the production facility that's being transferred, the seller is going to be interested in how does it ensure production going forward? What happens if the relationship with the buyer breaks down? So if there's tech involved in that, it could be in the production process, it could be in the facility itself, could be in the product itself, always slightly disconcerting. Partner walks behind you.
I wasn't going to hit you, just getting water.
Thank you. So again, going to be keen to ensure that it gets the right rights to technology. What sort of rights might buyers be looking at? Nothing particularly new here, obviously. If the seller owns all the relevant tech, then it has the potential, at least, to either transfer entire ownership of that to the buyer or to provide some form of license. And again, licenses, you'll be familiar with all of these. Could be an exclusive license, could be a sole license, so effectively the seller retaining the ability to use the technology as well, or it could be a non-exclusive license. And issues there will include territorial restrictions, use restrictions, royalty fees, and so on. And if the seller, in fact, doesn't own the tech, then, of course, you become in the situation where you're looking at contracts and the need to assign them and how to deal with that. And, of course, if the seller can't actually successfully assign the contracts or sub-license as appropriate, then it is going to need to go to the third parties and find out an alternative arrangement. So does it matter what type of rights a buyer gets in these kind of carve-out situations? Well, absolutely, of course it does. If the buyer, if this particular carve-out business is all about the technology, or the technology is somehow a core part of the deal, then the buyer is going to be very interested in making sure it gets the best rights it can to that technology. It's going to want to be able to develop that technology and use it without having to look over its shoulder to check that it's complying in some way with third-party rights or consent. It's also probably going to want to use that technology as a barrier to entry, not just against other businesses, but also against the seller. The seller is likely to have retained some level of experience and knowledge relating to the tech, and the buyer is not going to want that seller to be able to use that at the end of its non-compete covenant. But don't necessarily get too hung up with that, because if in fact it's not really core to the business, then it becomes less an issue of ownership and just a practical one of use. How does the buyer just make sure that it has enough rights to use the technology in whatever is appropriate, the appropriate way going forward? Sellers retain business using the divested business technology. I'm going to skip through this quickly because I know we're a little bit tight on time. Just pausing briefly to that banking carve-out scenario. In that situation, we mentioned the seller was going to have a long-term services agreement, so it's definitely going to be interested in having the right license to use the technology. And in that manufacturing scenario, the integrated nature of the seller's business, various approaches the seller might take there. It's interested in retaining technology for its own use, so it could transfer everything across to the buyer and take a license back. Seller's probably going to be more inclined towards trying to do it the other way, so hold on to everything and just give a license to the buyer. Interesting issues for both sides. I mentioned ERP system. How easy in these kind of carve-out deals is it to extract a business from an ERP system? Well, clearly the first thing you should do in that situation is hire Marina. And having done that, these things can, particularly in that manufacturing scenario, be incredibly complex and require a lot of time and thought to sort out. In that kind of integrated supply chain, you've got raw materials, you've got orders, you've got inventory, you've got invoices. At any point in time, all of those are swirling around in the system, quite possibly as just small parts of much bigger orders. So actually being able to identify the business, pick it up, transfer it across, very complicated process. Can be made easier if the ERP system in question identifies this particular carve-out business as a business unit in its own right. Sometimes we see that. Quite often, and in a recent example, not the case at all. So no separate understanding, if you like, about this particular piece of the business. So that required a lot of thought. Private equity houses, as Joe mentioned in the example, if you're looking at somebody that's got no manufacturing capability of their own, no particular manufacturing facility, they're going into this sort of business for the first time. They don't have an ERP system. And again, you're looking at real practical issues for one of these carve-outs as to how to make that work with your buyer. So one solution to that is to use the gap between signing and closing to prepare the business for handover. Another alternative is to enter into some form of post-closing transitional arrangement. Joe's going to talk about those a bit later. And just one sort of final ERP point on that. Even then, some of these ERP systems don't necessarily work well with products and orders and so on that don't actually relate to the enterprise anymore. They're now third-party orders. So again, that can require a lot of thought and planning when trying to figure out one of these carve-out deals. Due diligence, buyer and seller perspective. Again, I can whiz through this slide quickly. As Joe said, technology issues these days just form bigger and bigger parts of due diligence exercises on M&A deals, carve-outs in particular. Buyer desperate to understand what it actually needs from the seller, and having identified that, needs to figure out the right questions to ask the seller to make sure that it actually gets that. And the seller, if it wants a well-organized deal, it really needs to do all of that kind of thinking in advance as well, so that it can anticipate the buyer's needs. So what are the likely due diligence areas? Again, I suspect nothing new to the vast majority of you here. The sort of questions both sides in this kind of carve-out deal are interested in. Has the tech been created by employees? If it has, is it clear that the seller actually has ownership of that? Do the service contracts for those employees provide that, or other form of intellectual property assignments? Are there any other gaps in the chain of title to the tech? Disputes about ownership, infringements in particular, obviously going to be very interesting. Are any outstanding? Even if they're not outstanding, how have they been settled? That could affect the value of the technology from the buyer's perspective. Again, technology spend on third-party contracts, buyer's going to want to diligence those. Change of control restrictions, classic problems. You bear in mind that carve-out transaction is almost always going to be a transfer of assets. It's not likely to be a stock sale. So any of the contracts that need to be handed over prohibition on assignment, consents relating to that, very, very relevant to a tech carve-out. And as I said, I think already, if the technology account contracts, in fact, are going to stay with the seller, do those contracts actually allow the seller to provide the tech to the buyer in some other way? Jim.
So in addition to kind of the general diligence issues, we wanted to do a deeper dive on a couple issues that in particular we think are very important, top of mind right now for buyers and sellers. So first, open source software. Why should you care about open source software in your M&A deals? This is a topic worthy of an entire presentation, but we'll just hit some highlights here. So first, depending on which open source software license applies, you may be obligated to publicly share the source code for any software application that includes or even merely links to the relevant open source software. If the value of the target business is mostly tied up in its IP, and that IP is in software that's subject to one of these viral open source software licenses, that may have a significant impact on the valuation of the business. Similarly, if the buyer plans to integrate the target software into its own existing software environment, the buyer's own proprietary software source code could become subject to these viral open source licenses, obligating them to disclose it to the open source community. These issues could take significant time and expense to remediate either before or after a transaction, so it's better to get on top of them early. Next, security vulnerabilities. So Bob and Paul's presentation got into this a little bit, but contributors to open source are often volunteers, and they may not have the same level of dedication as a commercial software licensor to fixing security vulnerabilities and patching them once they come up. So what can you do as the buyer or the seller to address these risks? Really practical first step is Black Duck is a service that's out there that allows you to scan all the software of the target business, come up with a detailed report of all of the components, which open source software licenses apply, are there conflicts between licenses, what are the various issues in the environment. And then from there, you can figure out how to address those risks from a technical, legal, operational, valuation perspective, and you might want to hire some third-party experts to help you sort through the next steps. And again, the sooner that you know about these risks, the more you can do to resolve them operationally and in the purchase agreements, reps, and warranties on open source. So next topic, I'll beat the same joke that everybody has. We have to talk about cybersecurity and data, but this is very important. So, you know, again, I don't want to pretend that one slide is going to be sufficient on this topic. It's really a whole presentation, but let's just hit some highlights. So cybersecurity is particularly important if key assets of the target company include IP or other non-public data, so things like customer lists, other personal data, know-how, et cetera. So data breaches can materially undermine the value of the target company, the viability of a transaction, or the productivity or goodwill of the organization. So really serious issue. Buyers should be concerned about data privacy if the target company collects personal data of employees, customers, et cetera, and especially if it's across borders for all of the issues we talked about today with GDPR and other laws. If the target hasn't been compliant with relevant data protection and data privacy laws, bless you, the buyer may be at risk for some of the regulatory actions we talked about, the unbelievable fines, lawsuits, and reputational damage, of course. And then here on the slide, we've highlighted some of the bigger issues to address both during due diligence and during negotiation of reps and warranties in the purchase agreement. So just a few highlights. Does the target have a current, up-to-date written information security policy, commonly called a WISP, that they've materially complied with? Have they complied with relevant data privacy and data protection laws, including in relation to obtaining consents from the relevant data subjects? Can they lawfully transfer the personal data to the buyer at closing without violating the various privacy policies that might apply to that data? If there have been any data breaches, it may be worth engaging a third-party expert to come in and review the target systems for evidence of data breaches. a lot of times, and you've probably seen this in the news, a data breach can go undetected for 6, 12, 18 months. And from what I understand from people in our cybersecurity group, the results of these examinations can be eye-opening and, you know, have a major impact on the buyer's interest in pursuing a transaction sometime, especially if there's really valuable data or IP involved. If hackers have gone through the systems, cleaned out all the valuable know-how, the business may not be worth as much. So again, this is just a sample of some of the issues you should be thinking through. And I'll hand it over to Andy to talk about some purchase agreement considerations. You're much more considerate coming at the end of mine instead of mid-stride.
Well, thank you. Okay, so armed with the results of your due diligence findings, the parties moved to negotiation of the sale and purchase agreement. So what are the interesting issues from a technology perspective there? Those of you familiar with doing these kind of deals will probably have sat through endless negotiations with both sides arguing backwards and forwards about how to identify the assets to be transferred. Those are fights usually between the seller saying that they're prepared to transfer the assets that are exclusively used in the carve-out business and provide some form of license for the balance. And then the buyer is usually a little bit uneasy about that, and you get into debates around whether the test should be whether something is primarily used in the business or not. And you can see the difficulties from both sides there. Seller of one of these small brands out of a much larger setup, as we described in our manufacturing scenario, is almost certainly using technology in other parts of its retained business. Quite possibly doesn't even know where it's using that technology. Very uneasy about transferring something which is primarily used in the carve-out business for fear of transferring something else unwittingly, well, obviously unwittingly, but it didn't mean to. Buyer, paranoid, worried what it is that the seller is trying to screw them with by saying it's just stuff that is exclusively relating to the business. What is it they're missing? Something just has to be used to a tiny extent in another part of the seller's business, and suddenly the buyer doesn't get it. So lots of paranoia, lots of arguments around that. Tech absolutely at the center of those kind of arguments. We mentioned stock deals on the slide, really just for completeness. These carve-outs rarely are stock sales unless there's been some sort of pre-sale reorganization, which is a whole other topic altogether. Just one word of warning, those diligence issues are still going to be relevant even if it is a stock sale, and just look out for large organizations who, even if they've dropped the trading business into a vehicle with a view to sell, probably own their tech or their intellectual property generally in some other entity, and so you're still going to be interested in making sure you're getting the right rights. So this paranoid buyer worried about whether it's getting enough. How does it get comfort from the seller in that regard? So you head into classic representation territory. On the slide there is a whole list of tech-type warranties. And as we've just already getting a hook from Rebecca there, we definitely aren't going to go into those in any detail. They do exactly what it says on the tin, so when you get a chance to look at them later. Sufficiency of assets, though, probably the most interesting rep in any kind of carve-out deal. There are two examples on the screen there, so I'll leave you to read them at your leisure, but fundamentally that is the buyer saying, all this collection of assets, in whatever form you're handing them to me, whether you're transferring them outright, whether you're giving me some form of license, whether it's a transitional arrangement, I want you to tell me that all of that comes together in my hands to allow me to run the business in the way that, at the very least, you are running it on the day of closing. Lots of issues around that. You've got two examples there. The second one is more tech-specific. So tech is a really important part of the transaction. Always try and go for something specifically relating to that. It pulls out more disclosure about more interesting issues relating to the tech itself. last thing on sale and purchase agreements, again, can be hugely important in carve-out deals. I won't spend long on this. In that due diligence, if you found that tech contracts need third-party consent and you're the buyer, look to make it a condition to closing that consent has been obtained. Seller going to be uneasy about that, handing somebody else a lever in their deal. And in the most extreme example we've seen so far anyway, we have actually had one deal where an ERP system had to be cloned in its entirety, tested and accepted before closing as a condition to the deal happening. Joe.
So TSAs. Thanks, Andy. While transition services may seem like outsourced services, the traditional outsourcing model generally doesn't apply. So the seller is probably not a traditional outsourcer. They don't have the tools, the personnel, the structure, the contracts, et cetera, to behave like a professional outsourcing firm. So you need to kind of set your expectations off of that at some times. And then, things can get even more complicated if the divested business is providing substantial reverse transition services back to the seller. If that's the case, taking a hard line in negotiations from a supplier or a customer perspective can backfire on you when the shoe's on the other foot, so you have to be careful. So with that as background, the service provider, whoever that is, the seller or the divested business, usually commits to deliver the same level and quality of service that the divested business got when it was part of the seller. There may be tweaks to that based on changes in law, or if there are any inputs required from the divested business back to the seller to enable them to perform the services. Running through a few other key terms, change control, you're probably looking at changes being subject to mutual agreement in each case, read more money, with the exception that the service provider can push out changes to the extent that they're making those same changes to their retained organization. Term, you're usually looking at 3 to 18 months, maybe 21 or 24 in a particularly complex deal, and the supplier may demand shorter terms for services that are limited by third-party contracts. Indemnities and liability limits. So this is all a function of leverage, but at least from a starting position, the service recipient may have to fight hard for any remedy for a simple breach of contract or simple negligence. So the service provider, for all the reasons we talked about, they're not a professional service provider. These are on a transitional basis. They're usually going to push as an opening, position that will indemnify you for gross negligence, willful misconduct, fraud, maybe material breach of the TSA, maybe third-party claims, and that will be your sole and exclusive remedy under the TSA as the service recipient. Obviously, customers and buyers can and do get better terms than that, but you're not going to achieve the same type of liability scheme you would in an ordinary service agreement. So moving on to the long-term services agreements, these agreements tend to resemble long-term supply and outsourced services agreements more so than a short-term TSA, but on the other hand, again, these divested businesses of the seller, as the case may be, they're probably not professional service providers, so there's a little bit of a limit to that. Usually these agreements are critical to the long-term operations of the seller, the divested business, or both. And in many of the M&A transactions we've worked on over the past few years, these have actually become more contentious, complex, and time-consuming than the purchase agreement itself. A lot of the value of the transactions are in these long-term agreements. So what are some of the key issues that come up in these long-term agreements? So we'll just walk through our 2 carve-out scenarios just to give you some kind of real-world flavor for this. And obviously, these are highly fact-specific depending on the businesses, the industry, et cetera. So in our bank carve-out scenario, again, the divested business is going to provide services back to the seller in a long-term agreement for 5 years. So what are some of the key goals of the buyer entering into negotiations? First, they're going to want to try and make the agreement as standardized and supplier favorable as their existing customer contracts for the business that are assigned at closing. Second, they're going to want to build in flexibility to evolve the services towards that lower cost SaaS model that I mentioned before. So that might involve rights to the business to be pushing out changes on a unilateral basis with limited rights for the seller to get prior approval of those. So what are some of the seller's key goals? they're going to want to push to make the long-term service agreement as favorable as possible to them as the largest customer of the business and more like a traditional outsourced services agreement. So, along with that, they're going to want to obtain approval rights over service changes, or at least long notice periods and exit rights if they don't agree with those changes. So, on the other hand, in these circumstances, the seller needs to be careful about not pushing for too much control in the long-term agreement. Like I said at the start, that their valuation message has been, you can buy this business, it's going to be great, you can move to a low-cost SaaS model, and then you turn around in the long-term service agreement negotiations and say, wait a second, we want approval rights. That could undermine a key part of the deal. So getting the hook here, we've got to get the lemonade and coffee. So I'll run through these really quick. So manufacturing carve-out scenario. So the seller is going to be operating the divested manufacturing facility on behalf of the buyer. What are some of the key goals to the buyer? They're going to want to try to create appropriate incentives to the seller. So they're going to want uncapped liability for intentional refusal to perform services, gross negligence, willful misconduct, fraud, et cetera, substantial liability caps for ordinary negligence and breach of contract, so that there's skin in the game if they have a failure to perform services. And they're going to want to limit the seller's termination rights. Since their business is going to be dependent on this manufacturing, they can't have the seller terminating for a simple material breach or alleged material breach. What are the seller's key goals? Almost diametrically opposed. They're not going to want to take liability for simple negligence or breach of contract. They'll be pushing for a standard where we'll indemnify you for gross negligence, willful misconduct, fraud, but simple negligence, I'm sorry. I'm an expert in running a manufacturing facility. You'd never be able to run it this well on your own. You're a financial buyer. You're at a lower risk level, so I'm only going to indemnify you for gross negligence, willful misconduct, fraud. And by the way, consequential damages are going to be excluded completely. I'm not accepting a lost profit risk in a manufacturing context. So obviously these are strong initial positions. Parties may meet somewhere in the middle, but that's typically where these issues come up in this scenario. So in conclusion, technology and services are no longer an ancillary afterthought to be scrambled about, between signing and closing. These are core to deals now. They're becoming more core in the M&A marketplace. And by focusing on these issues early and at every stage of the deal, from transaction planning, due diligence, negotiation, post-signing, the parties can try to minimize their risk and maximize the values of these deals. I don't know if we have time for questions, Rebecca. I've scared everybody by speaking rapidly at the end of the presentation, and everybody just needs a coffee and a lemonade now. Thanks, everybody, for your time.